How do I turn the volume down?
Oh, on the computer, excuse me, on the computer screen, on the main screen on the lower right-hand corner where it's got the clock and stuff, there's a little speaker icon. And if you click it, a little window will pop up, and then you drag that number down to about 30.
This is on the left screen?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Do you see where I was talking about over there, where the clock is? Just beside the clock, it's a little speaker icon.
This is on the bottom.
Yes. On the bottom where the clock is.
Where's the clock?
Oh, okay. Go to the very top of the window and, yeah, that it says something about exits full screen.
Oh.
Yeah, click that. Okay, try that again. Okay, now drag your mouse all the way down to the bottom and see if the clock will show up. Now you put it in full screen. Hit the escape button on the keyboard.
What?
Hit the escape button on the keyboard. See if that'll do it for you. Very upper left-hand key. Yeah. Okay, now you see the clock. Lower right-hand corner of the monitor screen. Keep going to the right. Get down at the very bottom to the clock, and then there's there's a speaker icon thing.
I don't even see the clock.
It's right there at the very bottom. It says 9:33 a.m. and 11:14.
Yeah, okay, gotcha.
Just to the left of it, okay, just to the left of that is this thing that looks like a speaker. Yeah. And it should be about 30 to 40. Or about 29, 20, aim for 30. That's usually where I have it.
Maybe do about 30.
The lady just came in and complained.
Okay, well, if you're at 30, that's the volume that we always do. What is the reading right above that?
I got it at 31, that's okay.
Yeah, okay, now that right just above that, at the top of that little window, it says speaker, and then a colon, and then what does it say after that? Yeah, just above your mouse. What's it say? Read it to me.
30.
No, up above it's the words. That.
Realtek high definition.
Where's that?
Okay. There's a little drop down arrow beside it. Okay, I can't see through yet. And what are the other choices? If you click that, some other stuff will show up. Is the sound coming out of the ceiling speakers?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, well, it's where it should be. And if she's got a problem, that's on her now. So, okay. Let's just roll. There you go. Okay, and I hope y'all enjoyed that, everybody listening on the recording. Okay.
All right. Well, good morning, everyone. Welcome back. Sorry for the technical difficulties. It's the problem with distance education sometimes.
Yes.
We got a little bit behind, and I accidentally did not post or make available the quizzes. So I'll make all of those available right after class, and just take your time catching up on those. But I'll be watching and grading them as you go. So hopefully we'll get caught back up. We're going to talk about photosynthesis today, a little bit more about the plant chemistry. I put a link on Canvas, little homework reading there. It's short, sweet, and simple, but it's just kind of the common sense approach to plant chemistry. And you might really actually draw some parallels here if you guys are in the animal science class. And I mean, really, the way that animals and plants transport nutrients and chemicals and build proteins, DNA, all that good stuff, is actually pretty similar. The big difference is that plants do both. They do the regular transport methods as well as being autotrophic and making their own energy from the sun. So with that, let's start talking about photosynthesis. And I've kind of pared this down a little bit for you guys so that we have enough time to catch back up, get back into the water and mineral relationships that plants have with soil. So first, let's think back to how basically nature is kind of going through all these different cycles. And we talked about this with the ecology and the ecosystems. Now, really, even in our modified agriculture, it's still an ecosystem, and these cycles are still taking place. So the carbon cycle is one of the most important cycles for life on Earth. And it's basically looking how carbon, specifically carbon dioxide, is moved around. CO2, whether it's sometimes vilified these days, nothing wrong with carbon dioxide. It's just that when it starts to accumulate in the atmosphere, it causes the greenhouse effect, and that's due to emissions of carbon. But carbon is something that we cannot create nor destroy. We can only move it, just like other forms of energy. So carbon dioxide is very important. I mean, it's crucial for the respiration of organisms, animals, and plants. Also, anything that we do that is burning a fuel is going to release carbon. And you can kind of think of it in a way as coming from fixed forms of the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere through the sun. So carbon dioxide is fixed by plants, such as the tree in this image, and used along with water to make the sugars. So C6H12O6, the basic form of our chains of sugars that drive all the metabolism and other parts of plant life, that becomes fixed into the tissues of plants. So like for instance, in this tree, it's growing, it's sequestering that carbon, putting it into the body of the plant. And then when we cut down that tree, some of that is naturally going to release from that. Basically, it's still, even though it's dying at that point, it's still respiring and releasing carbon. But then we take that wood and we burn it over here in our home. That combustion also releases that carbon, which in a way is just kind of thinking like it's ancient sunlight that was sequestered in the form of the plant. And all of our fuels are that way. Fossil fuels are still carbon-based. They're just over, hundreds of thousands of years being compressed and turned into a different fuel. When we burn that, it's releasing carbon. When we plow the soil, it's releasing carbon because it's causing the respiration of the bacteria and other soil organisms to release that carbon. In fact, they say that the single largest contributor of carbon emissions to the atmosphere occurred over, about a decade there when we began to really practice agriculture in the Midwest and started to plow the prairie. So the prairies, these tall grasslands that were just full of carbon in the soil. And then when it was plowed, it activates these organisms that begin to respire and release that carbon. So the big deal is just, how do we keep that as a cycle, continually, cycling that carbon rather than just having it floating around in the atmosphere. So all organisms that photosynthesize, plants, blue-green algae, they are autotrophs. So they're making their own food. The organisms that cannot do that are the heterotrophs. So we have to get, at least a portion of our food directly from autotrophs or from the heterotrophs that feed on those autotrophs. So again, it's moving that carbon and moving that energy from the different trophic levels. So as long as we have an equal or nearly equal amount of carbon being taken up through photosynthesis as is being respired, then the atmospheric carbon dioxide levels will not vary. So that's, you know, the closed loop part of the cycle. Whatever is emitted is also taken up by plants. So theoretically, if we, you know, had every inch of soil covered with plant life and it's respiring and basically absorbing that carbon dioxide, then we could break even with, you know, the amount of emissions, theoretically anyway. But we also have the fact in there that we're harvesting part of that carbon and putting it into a different cycle through the bodies of animals. So plants have that leading role in the carbon cycle, and of course without them no other life on Earth could survive. Here's just a basic look at, you know, making hydrocarbon chains pretty much. Carbon at the center, bonding with hydrogen and sharing pairs of electrons. They call that covalent bonding in chemistry. So where they're connected, they're sharing electrons. So this is an ethane molecule. A carbon, basically carbon with 3 hydrogens connected to a carbon with 3 hydrogens. So carbon can form up to 4 bonds, and each of those bonds is basically 2 shared electrons. So how does this work for, you know, basically making these elements, these molecules, keeping them stable? Just so happens that carbon is kind of the magical element, and that no other element has this ideal combination to share electrons plus the stability of those bonds formed. So because of that, it's easier to move energy through, you know, carbon-based molecules, what we call organic molecules. And organic just meaning of life, and meaning that it's carbon-based, because carbon is basically it's like 90% of the molecules in our bodies and the bodies of plants and everything that's living has carbon in it. So here's just a look at just the oxidation reduction reaction, which is the basic biochemical reaction that is transferring electrons, which we're looking at as energy, between molecules. So basically what's going on is one compound is donating electrons, and in doing so it's losing them and becoming oxidized as oxygen. The other compound here is gaining those electrons and just basically moving them and transferring that energy. Carbon is at the center of the process because it is what is so versatile in donating and accepting the electrons, which basically underlies all the metabolism of plants and animals and life itself. So let's take a look here at this cornfield and think about how, you know, photosynthesis in the most simple form is basically just these leaves, you know, acting in a way like solar panels and converting the oxidized form of carbon, which is carbon with oxygen, carbon dioxide, to a reduced form of that carbon, which in the plant world is the carbohydrates, which is carbon with a water molecule in its basic form. But we build chains of those together to make more complex molecules. So the sugar C6H12O6, that would be 6 of these molecules of carbon connected to water, basically. So it's moving from oxidized carbon to reduced, and therefore transferring those electrons, moving that energy into a form that can be metabolized and can be used to make other metabolites and other reactions, eventually in the use of creating proteins and amino acids, the building blocks of life. So respiration is the process of converting that reduced carbon to oxidized carbon to generate other forms of energy. So here's just the most simple form of that chemical reaction. We've got carbon dioxide from the atmosphere plus water coming to us through the soil solution. Add to that light, which kind of acts as the catalyst of, to make photosynthesis occur in the chloroplasts inside of the leaves. And as they react, they turn it into basically a sugar, a carbohydrate, carbon with hydrate, water, and oxygen. So they release the oxygen and they use the sugar to continue transferring energy. We can actually see this in an electron microscope, looking at like 30,000 times human sight here. So zooming into that is basically looking at this specialized structure of the chloroplast. And the chloroplast is, basically where this transfer of energy is taking place, and basically moving it through this membrane, through these structures, stacked together to all together build, the solar panel of the plant, basically. So there's this complex array of membranes in the chloroplasts that are called thylakoids, and they are surrounded by stroma, which basically is just allowing these to stack on top of each other. And basically what they're doing is encasing that light energy, and through this stroma, they're basically transferring those electrons, and in the process, making sugars, making proteins. When we talk about photosynthesis, it's important to note that there are a couple of different ways that it happens. Photosystem 1 and 2, pictured here, are utilizing that light energy to obtain the electrons from water itself. So we have two molecules of water here. It's taking those electrons from the oxygen molecules out, combining them with hydrogen, splitting them up, using that electrical energy and getting 4 more electrons to donate, moving through this whole structure. So it's kind of a complex process of moving these electrons. And we can also generate some protons when water is split to just get that hydrogen ion, which is basically just one single proton, and have those being moved also through that thylakoid membrane across that gradient. Along with the proteins embedded there in the thylakoid, we also have the mechanism for ATP synthesis. And ATP, just remember that that is basically the energy carrier. We also have the reduced chemical that is formed called nicotinamide dinucleotide phosphate, or better known as NADPH. So that's just the reduced form moving those electrons. Basically the light reaction, the light dependent step of photosynthesis. So here we have both the oxidized and the reduced forms of that molecule, NADP, where basically here, looking at it in the center, the electrons from the water are being utilized in the reduction of that molecule. Basically just moving the energy, and in the process also creating the molecules that are used to make more DNA. In reducing the carbon dioxide to a sugar, to a carbohydrate, that happens in the Calvin cycle, which is basically just the photosynthetic carbon reduction cycle. It doesn't require light, but it does depend on the light reaction molecule NADPH, as well as the ATP that is produced by the light reaction. So although light is not involved directly in the Calvin cycle, it is indirectly involved and drives it, basically. So here's just the series of reactions, fixing that carbon dioxide to larger compounds, eventually into sugars, cellulose, and moving that throughout the plant. And it's being catalyzed by an enzyme that is referred to as rubisco, ribulose diphosphate carboxylase. The next two reactions continue to require ATP and NADPH, where it forms into a glycerol aldehyde, and then that has a reduced form of glycerate, which is the end product of the Calvin cycle. And notice that prefix there, the glyce is basically referring to the glycose. So basically that's taking these sugars, forming these sugars to drive the rest of the plant, creating other enzymes, catalyzing those enzymes, creating the proteins, and actually making the sugar itself that we get from plants. So glucose C6H12O6 is a stable, high energy molecule and is the source of the energy for the metabolism of the plants, and also provides some of the raw material for the other metabolites in the plants. And then it combines with other sugar molecules basically into chains that form sucrose, which again is our table sugar, or starches, depending on how it's bonded, which are used for energy transfer in the plant, especially in the seeds and roots as well, and also cellulose, which is forming kind of the rigid fibrous structure of the plant. So this one molecule is basically combined in chains to do it all. As we mentioned, sucrose, the most common form of sugar transported in plants, also the sweetener that we call table sugar. And it's basically a disaccharide molecule comprised of fructose and glucose molecules. Fructose we tend to think of as more the sugar that is in fruits, right? And glucose being that, kind of common energy carrier. Starch and cellulose, though, are also important. Starch for energy storage for the plants, and what actually becomes most bioavailable for other animals, the heterotrophs, for food, as well as it's also used in some industrial uses. A complex form of starch that is then fermented becomes ethanol that we use for fuel. And then cellulose, the basis of many of the fibers that we use, as well as that superstructure of the plant. And we talked about this earlier, but the only difference in starch and cellulose is just the structure of the molecule and how those molecules are bonded together. One simple change, basically turns starch into cellulose. So glucose synthesis has a series of steps to get to the end product, and I don't really think it's as important to look at or memorize these steps, but just note that it is this complex chemistry of the plant going through these steps to finally get the end product of glucose, oxygen, and which is then used to build the other sugars. The two most important concepts here is that, one, we've got reduced carbon compounds being shuffled around to generate those compounds that are required for specific purposes. And in the plant, that's saying, whether it's making root tissues or shoot tissues, flowers, seeds, it's the different molecules, the different metabolites being shuffled around there from the reduced carbon compounds. The other part of it is that we have these phosphorylated compounds, basically similar molecules that have phosphorus groups attached to them, and they are involved in metabolism because they are more reactive than those that don't have phosphorus in them. which, mentioning that, and we'll get kind of more into that when we talk about the mineral nutrition of plants, but phosphorus being one of those primary macronutrients that plants need, the NPK, nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. That's why, because phosphorus is used in the metabolism of the plant itself. When we look at the chloroplasts themselves, they contain different pigments. Some that are capable of just intercepting light and converting it from the electromagnetic energy from the sun into the chemical energy in plants, which we see as chlorophyll and some of the carotenoids. When these pigments are, basically receiving that light, they are absorbing most of that light from the red part of the spectrum, the red, orange, yellow, and the blue portions of the spectrum, blue, indigo, and violet. But the green part, the very center of the spectrum, they're actually reflecting. And so that's why we perceive leaves as being green. And if you're another organism like a honeybee, for instance, they don't actually see the leaves and the flowers as being the colors that we perceive. They are looking at different parts of those spectrums. But so both of those are important in the growth of plants. The full spectrum is very important in order to get that light energy. So when we are growing plants under artificial light, under supplemental lighting, then what we need to look at is getting sufficient amounts of the radiation from the red and the blue wavelengths in order to get photosynthesis. And when we're looking at that, we look at light as its intensity, which is basically just the amount of light being received. And full sunlight is approximately 2,000 moles per meter squared per second, just as a measure there. That light intensity is going to affect plant growth primarily just by influencing the rate of photosynthetic activity and the catalysts of that NADPH molecule and turning that into ATP and moving that energy. That effect is going to vary with different plants. And think about where the plants came from again. What are they accustomed to? What did they develop? What were they evolved to do? So the intensity of light can affect the morphology of the plant as well, in terms of the leaf size, the shape of the leaves, and the color. And as a general rule of thumb, we have thinner but larger in surface area leaves under low light intensity than under high light intensity. They would be thicker and smaller areas. And the reason for this is because when we have thinner and larger areas, more surface area, we have more area to absorb light. So you might have seen that, when plants don't get as much light as needed, then they would tend to grow larger, more succulent leaves to try to compensate for that. In high light intensities, we have darker green leaves as well because those chlorophyll cells are being closely packed, which allows better absorption of that light and more efficient use of that light. So if we have sun-loving plants, kind of evolved to growing out in open, often things like grasslands or higher elevations where you don't have as much tree cover. They, as a rule, require high light intensity. So corn, for instance, potatoes, sugarcane, most of our turf grasses. We also have plants that are adapted to grow better in low light intensities, and we often refer to those as shade-loving plants. And if you look at these, the Dieffenbachia and the Aglaonema, these are two tropical plants that we grow as houseplants, and they naturally evolved under the canopy of rainforests often. So when they're growing in those situations, they're naturally adapting to low light conditions. Most of our ferns also actually prefer low light intensities, and that's kind of coupled with the fact that they're reproducing by spores. Spores need a lot of moisture. You tend to have more moisture in low light conditions. So they are also adapted for growing in shade. Of course, that's not it. There's all kinds of other plant species that do well in high, low light intensities or just moderate light intensities. And that's important to know, what plant we should be able to grow in what place. And this graph here is basically looking at this light kind of saturation point, where at a certain point we get to where the plant cannot absorb any more light. And all plants are going to have a graph that looks like this. Basically, they've got the maximum amount of sunlight that they can actually absorb. So we don't know that for all plants, but just an important thing to think about. Trying to think where the plants came from, what they evolved for, how do we grow them, how do we provide the optimal environment. Only about 5% of the solar energy that actually reaches the Earth's surface is directly used in photosynthesis. A good portion of it is just lost. Another good portion of it is reflected. And that, basically is what we're looking at in the greenhouse effect, that carbon dioxide storing those infrared waves, which allows the Earth's surface to heat up. Part of what causes the changes of seasons. So very little of that is actually used in the direct process of photosynthesis. That light energy that is used for photosynthesis is absorbed by the chlorophyll molecules that are existing in those stacks in those thylakoid membranes. And we have to have multiple photons of light of that desired wavelength to be received by the multiple chlorophyll molecules to act as that catalyst to actually create sugar and move those electrons. So we also know that it requires carbon dioxide as well, right? So if a plant were to be just placed in a closed system, say that they had the light that they need, and that carbon dioxide is going to be assimilated, absorbed, and then put into these molecules that are involved in the movement of those electrons. Until the concentration of carbon dioxide reaches equilibrium. At that point, if there's no carbon dioxide available, the plant can no longer photosynthesize. It's basically just going to end. So CO2, especially when we're thinking about like greenhouse crops, or now these days we're doing a lot of growing in artificial conditions with no light, where it's all supplemental lighting. It's important to also add carbon dioxide to that as well. So we might actually have to inject CO2. We don't often have to do that like in our greenhouse here, because we have enough people going in and out releasing CO2 naturally. So this graph is just looking at that light saturation point coupled with the carbon dioxide rates, basically, and seeing that how when we have the greater amounts of carbon dioxide, photosynthesis can potentially double. So what are some ways that we can actually increase carbon dioxide? As I mentioned, we can inject it in greenhouses, or we can also just move it. So we have horizontal airflow fans, which basically increase the airflow around plants and move that carbon dioxide around, causing it to be more in contact with the leaves, which could reduce that need for supplemental CO2. We can actually do some things in some field situations to improve or increase CO2 as well. One is just manipulating the density and height of the plant canopy to increase the diffusion rate of carbon dioxide. So we might look at that in terms of pruning some growth, allowing for better airflow around it. We can also apply some crop residues or green manure crops to the soil, which can increase the CO2 levels in the atmosphere above the soil as that stuff breaks down. So in terms of heat, photosynthetic activity will approximately double for each 18 degrees increase in temperature for kind of the average plant species up to a specific point where you reach the optimal temperature for growth or the maximum temperature. And of course, that effective temperature varies with species. That's warm season or a cool season plant. Excessive temperatures, as we mentioned earlier, will reduce photosynthetic rates of some plants, mostly because it's causing the stomata, those pores on the undersides of the leaves, to close so that they are keeping that water vapor in the leaves and conserving water. That in turn is also going to block the flow of carbon dioxide into the leaf, which is going to reduce photosynthesis. If we continue to have reduced photosynthesis but still have increased respiration at higher temperatures, that can lower the sugar content of fruits grown in these conditions. So one thing that I've struggled with is getting good sweet tasting cantaloupes or muskmelons, and in this case it's due to a reduction in photosynthesis. Photosynthesis is what is driving the creation of the sugars in the first place, so the more photosynthesis we have, the sweeter anything is going to be, as long as it's coupled with carbon dioxide as well. So we want to try to grow things at the optimal temperature. We could potentially reduce temperatures by misting them with water, or even just irrigating them in some cases, especially with overhead, where we're reducing that temperature right around the leaves so that they don't need to conserve water as much. The stomata can open, they can absorb that carbon dioxide and continue to photosynthesize, making more sugar, making our cantaloupe sweet. Water also plays a very important role, as we saw earlier, in terms of making the carbohydrate. Takes the carbon, takes the water together, that's carbohydrate. If we have low soil moisture but hot and drying winds, then it will cause them to lose water through transpiration faster than their roots can absorb it. And that rapid water loss is going to cause those stomata to close and will temporarily cause the leaves to wilt. And there are some crops that we see that basically constantly on. Excessive soil moisture can also be a bad thing, because it's going to create an anaerobic condition, a lack of oxygen around the roots, which the roots also have to respire. They have to breathe as well. And that respiration of the roots is what allows the plants to take up water and take up minerals, which without the water, without the minerals, then that can indirectly affect photosynthesis as well. When we have the right amount of water available, then we have transpiration and photosynthesis working together in sync. As the plant respires, it transpires. So it has to actually open those stomata, absorb the carbon dioxide, and release the oxygen in order for photosynthesis to be complete and that process to actually make sugars. So if we have areas where we have sufficient rainfall in the growing season, then we basically have a compromise between carbon dioxide intake and water loss. And where we have that sufficient rainfall, it's not an issue. If we don't have sufficient rainfall, then we get that equilibrium out of sync. We might have more transpiration than photosynthesis, which causes wilt, and eventually, if that's not corrected, will cause death in the plants. The plants that have evolved in climates where there is, sufficient natural rainfall often go through this particular photosynthetic pathway, which we kind of think of as the regular photosynthetic pathway, the C3 plants. Because carbon dioxide enters the leaf, is directly used to generate a 3-carbon molecule phosphoglycerate. So that's C3. The plants that have evolved in arid regions have adapted to basically conserve water and keep that transpiration and photosynthesis in sync, basically, at equilibrium, so that they're still able to conserve the water that is in the soil, that is found in the plant, without inhibiting photosynthesis. So we have 2 different photosynthetic pathways. One, the C4 mechanism, and that is found often in tropical grasses such as corn, sorghum, or warm season turf grasses, and some other species as well. And basically, it's just a more efficient pathway for photosynthesis, where the carbon dioxide temporarily attaches to that 3-carbon organic acid that then makes it a 4-carbon organic acid, so called C4 instead of C3. And basically, that's allowing it to increase carbon dioxide capture efficiency without losing the water vapor through the stomata and the leaves. So basically, it's just a more efficient form of taking in CO2 without reducing the water loss. We also have a CAM pathway as well. And the CAM plants are usually succulents and cacti, and they evolved in desert conditions, very arid conditions, where basically they're going to store water and absorb heat and keep the plants cool in the day when the temperatures are hot, but keep the stomata closed. But then that CAM attaches the carbon dioxide to a 3-carbon organic acid at night. So the stomata are opening at night, meaning that basically they lose less water. And that carbon dioxide is held onto that acid until that light is available and released the following day as part of the regular photosynthetic pathway. So they have slower growth because of this, but they're able to, continue to grow and photosynthesize and respire even in, very arid conditions. So plant growth significantly increases with photosynthesis, as you might imagine, which again is driving all the metabolism for the plant. So the creation of the sugars, creation of all the secondary chemicals, proteins, the DNA, etc. It's important for life. And more photosynthesis equals more growth, more sugars, etc. As long as all the other environmental factors are, in sync with that. So, a plant can't photosynthesize if the chlorophyll is dead, right? So, if you have too low of temperatures that causes the plant cells to freeze, then guess what? They can't grow anymore. So we have to have all of these optimal conditions occurring together at the same time. As a single leaf develops, the photosynthetic rates are going to rise in step with that expansion of the leaf. It's adding on to that solar panel as it grows, basically. But it's going to reach a point of full expansion. And when it reaches this full expansion, it becomes what we call a source leaf, because basically the carbohydrate that is synthesized in that leaf is in excess of what the leaf itself needs. So it's a source for sugar, and it's moving those sugars through the phloem to other tissues of the plant that are actively growing. So at some point, the leaf stops growing once it reaches its full size. It moves those excess sugars that it's creating to other parts of the plant to utilize it for growth. Those other parts, those tissues that are absorbing those sugars, we call sink tissues. So it's a source and it's a sink, and it's part of that cycle that's happening within just the plant itself. The actual respiration, though, the breathing of the plant, is what is extracting the energy that is stored there in the glucose and the starches, and converting it to the other forms that are then used to synthesize biochemicals for the rest of the tasks that the plant needs to complete. And that could look something like this, where we're transferring the energy of ATP and the ADP. So it's basically glucose plus oxygen plus ADP plus the phosphorylated molecules to give carbon dioxide, water, and then ATP, the energy itself. So basically, respiration is kind of the reverse of photosynthesis in a way. It's, we're doing the oxidation and the reduction kind of simultaneously at the same time to move that energy. So in terms of looking at the carbon dioxide and the carbohydrate, it's reversing what photosynthesis is doing. And releasing that CO2 through that respiration can then be used in photosynthesis, which completes the plant's kind of carbon cycle. It's part of it. The first step of respiration itself is glycolysis, which is the conversion of glucose into pyruvate, which takes place in the cell's cytoplasm itself. So we have two pyruvic acid molecules here, pyruvate plus ATP and NADH, which are oxidizing and reducing those molecules and transferring those electrons. The second step of respiration actually occurs in the mitochondria, what we refer to kind of as the powerhouse of the cell, converting that energy into a more usable form, basically. And I'm not going to dwell on this, but basically it's moving that glucose, making more complex molecules through the oxidation and reduction of it into the mitochondria, where then it is formed into different molecules that are used for the metabolism of the plant. Much of that reducing power when we're watching this in the glucose molecule is actually retained there in the NADH and another molecule, the FADH. Basically, that next step, that third step of respiration, is reducing those nucleotide molecules and oxidizing them to generate ATP again. So it's basically just a chain of making and moving ATP to different parts of the plant, donating those electrons, and then finally molecular oxygen being the final electron acceptor, and water vapor and oxygen being the final products that are released through that respiration out of the leaf. And this is just another image basically looking at that oxidation and reduction, moving those electrons through different carriers, and then finally to water and oxygen being released from the plant itself, which all of this in sync is what's driving growth. It has to occur at equilibrium in order for the plant to continue to actually grow. They say that nearly 60% of the energy in a glucose molecule is conserved in the production of ATP, which again is that energy currency of all living things, not just plants, being transported to other places in the cell, used for a wide variety of other chemical reactions, making new tissues, making sugars, making seeds. The net photosynthesis, though, is the term for the amount of the photosynthates that are produced above the amount required for the plant just to live. And that accumulation of those photosynthates is what we need to actually be able to get the harvestable portions of whatever crop it is that we're growing. If the living plant material is allowed to respire at normal levels, when photosynthesis cannot take place, then it reserves them in carbohydrates and uses those for respiration. It's the loss of those carbohydrates, such as in the harvested portion of the plant, they continue to respire basically, which causes a shortened storage life or shelf life and lowers the quality of products just with time. The plant material technically is still alive. It's still respiring after we harvest it. It doesn't die. Those cells continue to react and respire. And that whole issue is what causes us to treat different harvested portions of crops differently. And on that note, just ask you guys if you have any questions or concerns about that material on photosynthesis. I tried to boil it down to just the basics for you. You know, light drives this process of moving energy, and that drives everything. So on the most practical standpoint for talking about crop production, we want to have the greatest amount of photosynthesis possible. So we want the largest surface area of leaves, you know, actually absorbing that light energy and turning that into plant products. Well, if you guys don't have any questions or concerns, we'll go ahead and sign off for today. Be sure to look there on Canvas at kind of just some of the basics there, some good depictions of how this plant chemistry occurs, probably better than I explained it. So if you have any questions, comments, or concerns, feel free to give me a shout. Watch for those quizzes opening, and just get on there and take those quizzes in a timely manner.
Okay. Bye, everybody.
See you on Wednesday.